Hello, my name's Austin Smith, and I'm going to be reading a few poems from a new book of poems I just had published called Almanac. And the first poem I'm going to read is called Letter to My Father, Written in a Bar in Mitchell, South Dakota. When you were my age, you passed through these towns on the wheat harvest, drank beer in this bar, served by this bartender, who was a young woman then and beautiful. 30 years dragging the same cigarette through her lungs like freight has ruined her looks. 30 years feeling the same bottle of beer sweating in her hand. She's not what she was those nights you and Dale wore your cowboy boots and hats and leaned against this bar gashed with stars and drank until the brown bottles looked like grain silos on a horizon. Her cigarette good enough for a sunset. There are still a few tunes in this jukebox you might have played, purchased with the dimes your sweat became. You blew it all on beer and Grateful Dead songs, singing in the attics of your lungs, driving that train, high on cocaine. Casey Jones, you better watch your speed. Then stumbling across the road to the motel where your boss lay worrying about the futures of grain. It was the first leg of harvest. The whole summer lay ahead of you, all of Kansas and Texas, all those miles of asphalt and acres of wheat. Dale's death was small then. It was a moon-shaped disk of ice on some country road in Missouri, half a summer and an autumn and half a winter away. How could either of you have seen it? You slept in the same bed, shirtless in your blue jeans like brothers. The next poem I'm going to read is called Bingo, and it's about the Mississippi River flood. Bingo. The night before the river won the bingo game by rising up suddenly in its second-hand corduroy suit, the arms of which were too short to fill the square of every acre, they sat playing bingo while the rain lashed the windows like a jockey, and the cars swung the motion sickness of their fists at the dark like drunk pugilists, and the town grocer kept his store open 2 hours later than usual to give the people a chance to stock up for the big storm. And if you'd been walking down a street in that town that night, you'd have noticed all the living rooms were lit blue as jazz clubs with the radar of it, and the people in the bingo hall were talking about it in the silence between coordinates, and whoever won big that night was forgotten. And when they walked out, they had to confront the brute fact of the flood, the way drunks walking out of a bar are confronted with the fact of space. The rain coming down now in long chords like the chords of a church organ. The rumble of the river, the sound of a train coming at you through a tunnel before its light reaches you. There were those who had left for the high country with what they could carry, but they had packed in shame in the night. Because of the myth that the river could feel fear, and that the worst floods were after the mass evacuations, that later those people would return to find that the river had taken over their houses like an occupying army, that it had thumbed through the diaries of their daughters, that it had drunk all the liquor and replaced it with sand, that it had put on the woman's clothes like a cross-dresser, that it had climbed the stairs like an alcoholic father, only to find no one to beat up on in the attic, that it had sat in the bathtub for 4 days in its own filth, that it had also flooded the New England town depicted on the wallpaper, that it had disinterred the graves of relatives its grandfather had killed, that it had put on cowboy boots too small for its feet and danced on the table to some banjo song of death that has never been sung above water, that it had written itself into the will and named itself the sole inheritor of everything, that it had put its head in the stove and stabbed itself in the heart with several knives and swallowed 40 aspirin and hadn't died, that it had not died when it left, but simply wrote its number on the fridge in mud and went back to bed to roll and pitch in fitful sleep for another 20 years. But we were speaking of the night before the flood, the night the man who won big in bingo walked across the street and bought a round for the sandbaggers. The next poem I'm going to read is called On a Greyhound Bus in America, and it's more or less a true story. On a Greyhound Bus in America. There were only a handful of us left by the time we reached Des Moines. The guy who kicked my seat in anger all night from Sacramento to Reno got kicked off in Reno in a dark lot outside a maximum security prison the driver yelling after him, "You got more business being in there, mister, than being on my bus," waking the woman with Tourette's, who screamed and swore for what was left of the night, claiming the man to her right was masturbating, until a prissy middle-aged lady leaned forward and said, "Will you please be quiet?" And the whole bus shook with laughter. By Iowa, the old woman sitting next to me, who'd had her luggage misplaced in a transfer in Omaha, had had enough. She whispered to me, "Young man, I tell you, I don't like this bus driver. I don't think he even likes himself." An hour later, she announced to the entire bus, "When I get home, I'm gonna put a sign up in the yard that says done for the duration." The driver yelled, "I've had enough of that racket back there." He thought the woman with Tourette's was acting up. She'd gotten off in silent awe in Omaha. And the next poem I'm going to read is called Memoir of My Imaginary Sister. I actually don't have a sister, so I had to imagine one. Growing up in a world of men, she was tougher than all of us combined. She never brushed her hair. Some evenings, our mother would come downstairs with her brush, begging to brush it for her, for her hair was beautiful, long, and golden. When she was younger, our father called her Rapunzel, but she grew to despise the nickname. Most nights she'd say no, and watching my mother climb back up those stairs with that brush that had been her mother's and her mother's mother's was the saddest thing. My sister loved horses more than people, spoke of Montana as if it were the only place where there were horses. She said in Montana, after you die, you become a horse, that was your heaven. We all just smiled, like when a boy says he wants to be an astronaut. But she meant it when she said she was moving there. The night before she left, she came downstairs and let our mother brush her hair one last time. Just like Rapunzel, our father said under his breath, a mischievous look in his eye. My sister allowed it. That night, she and I stayed up long after everyone had gone to bed, listening to the radio. In the morning, she was gone before anyone could say goodbye. My parents went out west once to see her, but came back shaking their heads. She'd met a man who called himself a cowboy and lived with him on what he called a ranch, where they kept what he called 2 horses. She worked waiting tables at a diner in town, and he claimed, worked cattle. To this day, I haven't heard from her, but I know I had a sister once because I found my mother's brush in a drawer last winter and saw it matted there, hair the color of gold or of straw ready to bale. Thank you.